The call that started it all. Dr. Amara Ellis was an accomplished trauma surgeon with a reputation for being calm under pressure. Her career had taken her through some of the most challenging surgeries and emergencies imaginable. Yet, none of that prepared her for the call that would change everything. It was a cold, moonlit evening when the phone buzzed on her kitchen counter. She had just finished a long shift and was looking forward to some much-needed rest. Reluctantly, she glanced at the screen. The name on the display made her pause. Chief Samuel Carter, a powerful and well-known figure in the local police force. Amara picked up, her voice steady but curious. Dr. Ellis speaking. The voice on the other end was frantic, uncharacteristic for the stoic chief. Dr. Ellis, my son, he's been in a terrible accident. You're the only one I trust to save him. Please, we're at Highland Regional. Amara's heart sank. Highland Regional was over an hour away. Chief Carter, I'll leave right now, but you need to stabilize him until I arrive. There's no time. He's fading fast, Carter pleaded. I've heard about your skill. If anyone can save him, it's you. Despite her exhaustion, Amara grabbed her medical bag and car keys. She could hear the desperation in Carter's voice. His son's life hung by a thread, and time was running out. Every second mattered. The journey begins. The highway stretched ahead of her, long and dark, illuminated only by the glow of her car's headlights. Amara's hands gripped the steering wheel as her mind raced through possibilities. From the symptoms Carter had described, it sounded like a ruptured spleen, deadly if not treated immediately. She mentally rehearsed the steps of the procedure, determined not to let her fatigue cloud her focus. Amara's career had taught her to thrive in high-stakes situations, yet tonight felt different. It wasn't just the urgency of the call. It was the unspoken tension that came with who was asking for her help. Chief Carter was a man of influence, but also someone whose force had been at the center of multiple controversies. Amara herself had once been stopped by officers from his precinct for looking suspicious in an affluent neighborhood, a memory that still stung. Pushing the thought aside, she reminded herself of her oath as a doctor. This wasn't about politics or prejudice. It was about saving a life. An unwelcome interruption. The hum of the engine was interrupted by a flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. Amara's stomach dropped. She glanced at the speedometer. She wasn't speeding. She pulled over to the shoulder, her heart pounding. A tall officer approached her window, flashlight in hand. His face was set in a mask of suspicion. "License and registration," he barked. Amara complied, keeping her movements deliberate and calm. "Officer, I'm Dr. Amara Ellis. I'm on my way to perform emergency surgery on a critically injured patient. Every second counts." The officer's eyes narrowed as he examined her documents. "What kind of doctor speeds through here at this hour?" he muttered, as though speaking to himself, but loud enough for Amara to hear. Another officer appeared on the passenger side, his hand resting near his holster. "Why don't you step out of the vehicle, Mom?" he said coldly. Amara's pulse quickened. "There's been a misunderstanding. I'm not speeding without reason. I'm trying to save a life. Call Chief Carter if you don't believe me." "Chief Carter," the first officer scoffed. "Nice try. Step out of the car." Rising tension. Amara felt a knot tighten in her chest as she exited the car, medical bag in hand. The officers exchanged skeptical glances as she tried to explain her urgency. One officer reached for her bag, his tone dripping with condescension. "What's in here?" "Drugs." "It's medical equipment," Amara snapped, her patience wearing thin. "You're wasting valuable time. Call Chief Carter now." The officer hesitated, perhaps recognizing the authority in her voice. Finally, he pulled out his radio. "Dispatch, we've got a suspicious individual claiming to be a doctor en route to see Chief Carter. Can you confirm?" The moments stretched into an eternity. Amara could feel the seconds slipping away, each one a dagger to her resolve. She thought of Carter's son, barely clinging to life, and fought to stay composed. "Confirmed," came the voice from the radio. followed by a hurried message from Carter himself. "Let her go. That's my son's doctor." The officers' faces shifted from suspicion to discomfort. "You're free to go," one muttered, handing back her documents. "Sorry for the inconvenience." Amara didn't reply. She snatched her belongings and got back into the car, her hands trembling as she started the engine. As she sped off, the red and blue lights faded into the distance, but the encounter lingered, a bitter reminder of the challenges she faced beyond the operating room. A race against time. By the time Amara reached Highland Regional, her exhaustion had been replaced by a fierce determination. She burst through the emergency room doors, her white coat flowing like a cape. The scene was chaotic. Nurses and doctors rushed about, their faces etched with urgency. Chief Carter stood in the corner, his commanding presence reduced to that of a desperate father. His eyes met Amara's, filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "He's in there," he said, his voice breaking. "Please save him." Amara nodded, pushing past him into the operating room. The sight that greeted her was grim. The boy, Elliot, was pale and unresponsive, his pulse faint. The team had done what they could, but it was clear that he needed more than basic intervention. "Let's get to work," Amara said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. She scrubbed in, donned her gloves, and stepped into the role she was born for. The savior in the chaos. The first incision. The hours that followed were a blur of blood, precision, and teamwork. Amara's hands moved with practiced skill as she repaired the damage to Elliot's spleen and stopped the internal bleeding. Every step was critical, every decision fraught with risk. The room was silent except for the beeping of machines and the steady rhythm of her commands. As dawn broke, Amara made the final stitch. She stepped back, her gloves stained red but her heart lighter. Elliot's vitals were stabilizing. He wasn't out of the woods yet, but he had a fighting chance. Exhausted, Amara left the operating room to find Chief Carter waiting. His face was etched with worry, but as she gave him the news, relief washed over him. "You saved him," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Amara nodded, too tired to speak. She wasn't looking for gratitude. She was simply glad she had been able to do her job, despite the obstacles. A moment of reflection. As Amara drove home that morning, the events of the night replayed in her mind. The encounter with the officers, the tense moments in the operating room, the weight of knowing that a life had hung in the balance. It wasn't the first time she had faced prejudice, nor would it be the last. But it was a stark reminder of how much work remained to be done, not just in saving lives, but in changing the system that so often stood in the way. This was only the beginning. Amara knew her story didn't end here. The barrier of prejudice. The adrenaline from the surgery had worn off, leaving Dr. Amara Ellis feeling a deep exhaustion as she sat in the small break room at Highland Regional. The faint hum of the vending machine filled the silence as she sipped on a lukewarm cup of coffee. Her mind replayed the events of the night. The life-threatening surgery, the tense encounter with the police, and the chief's broken plea for her help. Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. A text from her close friend and fellow surgeon, Dr. Naomi Harper, flashed on the screen. "Heard about last night. You okay?" Amara hesitated before responding. She wanted to say she was fine, but the words felt dishonest. After a moment, she typed back, "I saved him. That's what matters." But it wasn't easy. Reflections on the highway. As she left the hospital, the crisp morning air greeted her. The highway stretched before her like a long, unending path, a metaphor for the obstacles she faced not only as a doctor, but as a black woman in a field dominated by biases and expectations. The events of the night felt like a cruel reminder of the barriers she still had to overcome. The officer's suspicion, the drawn-out delay, the gun pointed in her direction, each moment had etched itself into her memory. She had been calm, composed, and professional, but deep down, the fear had been real. It wasn't the first time she had been questioned or doubted because of her identity, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. Her thoughts drifted to Chief Carter, a man of authority, power, and privilege. He had needed her when his own world was crumbling. Yet his own officers, his own system, had nearly cost his son's life. She wondered if he had fully realized the gravity of what had happened on that highway. The hospital's quiet realities. By mid-afternoon, Amara returned to her home hospital for her next shift. The bustling corridors and the steady hum of medical equipment provided a strange comfort. Here she wasn't just a name or a face. She was Dr. Ellis, the trauma surgeon known for her unshakable focus and precision. But even within these walls, she wasn't immune to prejudice. She recalled the subtle looks from some colleagues, the occasional hesitation in trusting her judgment, and the whispers that followed when she outperformed her peers. She had built her career by being twice as good as anyone else, but the weight of proving herself day after day was exhausting. One of the junior residents, Dr. Paul Kim, approached her in the hallway. "Dr. Ellis, I heard about last night. Word gets around fast." His tone was hesitant, almost as if he wasn't sure how to bring it up. Amara raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly did you hear, Dr. Kim?" "That you saved the police chief's son after being, He paused, searching for the right words. "Delayed." Amara's lips tightened. "That's one way to put it." Dr. Kim shifted awkwardly. Well, it's incredible what you did. Not everyone would have had the composure to handle all that." She studied him for a moment. "Composure isn't optional in this line of work, Dr. Kim. Patients don't get second chances because of someone else's bias." He nodded, looking chastened. "You're right. I'm sorry. I didn't mean." "I know," she said, her tone softening. "But remember this. The moment we let their doubts define us, we've already lost. Keep that in mind." The ripple effect. Later that evening, Amara received an unexpected visitor. Chief Carter stood in the hospital lobby, his imposing frame looking out of place amidst the sterile environment. His face was marked by exhaustion, but his eyes held a new weight, a mixture of gratitude and guilt. "Dr. Ellis," he began, his voice steady but somber, "I wanted to thank you again. For everything." Amara folded her arms. "Your son's recovery is thanks enough, Chief. How is he?" "He's stable," Carter said, relief softening his tone. "You gave him a chance. I'll never forget that." She nodded, waiting for him to continue. There was something else he wanted to say. She could see it in the way he avoided her gaze. "I also came to apologize," he finally admitted, "for what happened on the highway." Amara's expression didn't change, but her silence invited him to continue. "My officers, they had no right to stop you. And what they did, what they almost did, was inexcusable. I failed you as a leader, and I failed my son." "You failed more than just me and your son, Chief," Amara said, her tone measured. "You failed every person who's been in my position. Every life that's been lost because of delays like that." Carter's jaw tightened. "I know, and I'm going to make it right." Amara tilted her head, studying him. "What does making it right mean to you?" "It means accountability," he said firmly. "It means looking at the system I've spent my life defending and admitting that it's broken. And it means starting with those two officers." Uncomfortable truths. Carter's words were a start, but Amara wasn't convinced. She had seen too many promises of change fade into hollow gestures. Still, she couldn't ignore the sincerity in his voice. "Accountability is a good first step," she said, "but it's not enough. Change requires more than words, Chief. It requires action. It requires courage." "I'll do whatever it takes," he vowed. "Then start by listening," she said, "to people like me, to the stories you've ignored or dismissed. And don't just listen. Act on them." Carter nodded, his expression resolute. "I will." As he left, Amara felt a flicker of hope. It was a fragile thing, easily extinguished, but it was there. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something bigger. The echo of a night lost. That night, as Amara prepared for bed, She stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. The face staring back at her was tired but unbroken. She thought about Elliot Carter, the boy whose life had been spared, and the countless others who weren't as lucky. She thought about the officers who had stopped her, their suspicion rooted in ignorance and prejudice. And she thought about Chief Carter, a man forced to confront the flaws in his own system when it was almost too late. Amara knew the road ahead would be long. Change was slow, and resistance was inevitable. But she also knew she couldn't stop fighting, not for herself, not for her patients, and not for the future. As she turned off the light, a single thought lingered in her mind. Some battles aren't won in the operating room. Some battles are fought in the hearts and minds of those who need to see the world differently. The consequences of silence. The days following the surgery were anything but calm. Dr. Amara Ellis returned to her regular shifts at the hospital, but the events of that night lingered in her mind like a stubborn shadow. She wasn't the type to dwell, but this wasn't something she could easily shake off. Saving Elliot Carter had been a triumph of her skills and determination, but the confrontation with the police and the systemic rot it exposed stirred something deeper within her. As she walked through the hospital corridors, she couldn't help but notice how colleagues approached her differently. Some seemed more distant, as if afraid to bring up the incident. Others offered awkward attempts at camaraderie, their words dripping with well-meaning but misplaced sympathy. "Dr. Ellis," a voice called from behind. She turned to see Dr. Naomi Harper, her closest confidant, hurrying to catch up. "Naomi," Amara said with a faint smile. "Let me guess. You've heard all about it." "Of course I have," Naomi said, falling into step beside her. "You're the talk of the hospital. The chief of police himself publicly thanked you. But that's not what I care about. Are you okay?" Amara hesitated, her gaze fixed ahead. "I'm fine. Just tired." "Fine," Naomi pressed, her tone skeptical. "Come on, Amara. I know you better than that. What really happened?" Unspoken fears. Amara sighed as they entered the break room. The small space smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant, the same as it always did, but today it felt stifling. She poured herself a cup and leaned against the counter, choosing her words carefully. "They stopped me on the highway," she began. "Two officers. They wouldn't believe I was a doctor. They made me step out of the car at gunpoint." Naomi's eyes widened in shock. "Are you serious? What did you do?" "What could I do?" Amara said, her voice low but firm. "I stayed calm. I explained who I was. I called the chief. And even then, it took far too long for them to let me go." Naomi was silent for a moment, her expression a mix of anger and disbelief. "Amara, that's..." She shook her head. "That's unacceptable." "It is," Amara agreed, "but it's not surprising. You and I both know this isn't new. It's just the first time it almost cost someone their life on my watch." Chief Carter's promise. That evening, as Amara prepared to leave the hospital, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was Chief Carter. She debated whether to answer but eventually picked up. "Dr. Ellis," his voice came through, firm but tinged with an uncharacteristic humility. "I wanted to give you an update. The two officers involved in stopping you have been suspended pending investigation." Amara paused, processing his words. "Suspended? That's a start, but it's not enough." "I agree," Carter said, "which is why I've ordered mandatory bias training for the entire department. I'm also working on a community outreach initiative to address systemic issues in our precinct." Amara raised an eyebrow, skepticism creeping into her voice. "Bias training and outreach. Do you really think that's going to fix the problem?" "It's a step," Carter replied. "I know it's not enough, but I'm committed to making real changes. That starts with admitting where we failed." For a moment, Amara didn't respond. She could hear the sincerity in his voice, but she'd heard promises like this before. Too often, they led to performative gestures and little else. "I hope you mean that," she finally said. "Because if you don't, this will just be another story about a system that let people down." The public eye. Word of the incident had spread beyond the hospital. Local news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a tale of heroism and injustice. Amara hated the attention. She didn't want to be a symbol or a talking point. She just wanted to do her job. But the media frenzy showed no signs of slowing down. A week after the surgery, she was invited to speak at a community forum organized by local activists. At first, she hesitated. Public speaking wasn't her forte, and she wasn't sure she wanted to relive the events of that night. But after some thought, she realized this wasn't about her discomfort. It was about using her voice to shed light on a larger issue. The forum was held in a community center packed with residents, activists, and a handful of reporters. As Amara stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I'm not here to tell you a story of heroism," she began, her voice clear and measured. "I'm here to tell you a story of failure. Not my failure, but the failure of a system that almost cost a young boy his life." She recounted the events of that night, sparing no detail. She described the fear she felt as the officers questioned her, the frustration of losing precious time, and the weight of knowing how easily it could have ended differently. "This isn't just my story," she concluded. "This is the story of countless others who faced similar obstacles, many of whom didn't have the privilege of a second chance. If we want to change this, we need more than words. We need action." The audience erupted into applause, but Amara felt no sense of triumph. She hadn't come for accolades. She had come to make people listen. Behind closed doors, not everyone was supportive. In the days following the forum, Amara received an anonymous letter in her mailbox. The note, written in shaky handwriting, was filled with vitriol. "You think you're some kind of hero. Stay in your lane. Don't push your luck." Amara stared at the letter for a long moment before folding it and tucking it into her desk. She wasn't surprised, but that didn't make it any less unsettling. When she mentioned it to Naomi, her friend was livid. "You need to report this." "To who?" Amara said bitterly. "The same system I'm speaking out against." "No thanks." Naomi frowned but didn't push further. She knew Amara well enough to understand her resolve. If she was going to fight this battle, she'd do it on her own terms. A systemic problem. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of hospital work, community meetings, and media appearances. Amara found herself thrust into a role she hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. She became a voice for change, not because she wanted to, but because she knew she had to. Meanwhile, Chief Carter faced increasing scrutiny. Activists demanded more accountability, while some members of his department resisted the changes he was trying to implement. The tension was palpable, both in the community and within the force. One evening, Carter called Amara again. "Dr. Ellis, I need your help." "My help?" she said, surprised. "With what?" "With rebuilding trust," he admitted. "The community doesn't trust us, and frankly, they have every right not to. I want to create a citizens' advisory board, people who can hold us accountable. And I want you to be a part of it." Amara was taken aback. "Chief Carter, I'm a doctor, not a policymaker." "You're also someone the community respects," he said, "and someone who understands what's at stake. Please, think about it." Amara didn't give him an answer right away. She wasn't sure she wanted to take on such a role. But deep down, she knew this was about more than her. It was about creating a future where stories like hers didn't have to be told. The weight of responsibility. That night, as she sat alone in her apartment, Amara reflected on everything that had happened since that fateful call. She had saved a life, but in doing so, she had uncovered a deeper truth, a truth about prejudice, power, and the fight for justice. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: she couldn't stay silent. Whether as a doctor, a speaker, or an advocate, she would continue to fight, not just for her patients, but for a world where their lives weren't jeopardized by the very systems meant to protect them. And so, as the city slept, Amara made a decision. She would step into the role Chief Carter had offered, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. Some battles were fought in the operating room. Others were fought in the hearts and minds of those unwilling to change. She was ready for both. A seat at the table. A month had passed since Dr. Amara Ellis saved Elliot Carter's life, and her world had changed in ways she couldn't have predicted. The incident on the highway, the surgery, and the aftermath had not only thrust her into the spotlight, but also positioned her as an unexpected advocate for systemic reform. Chief Samuel Carter had been persistent about her involvement in the Citizens Advisory Board. Despite her initial hesitation, Amara eventually agreed. She understood the power of her voice, and while the role wasn't one she sought, it was one she couldn't ignore. It wasn't just about holding the police accountable. It was about ensuring that no one else had to endure what she did. The first meeting. The advisory board's inaugural meeting was held in the municipal building, a stark and imposing structure that seemed to embody the rigidity of the systems they were there to address. The room was filled with a mix of community leaders, activists, and representatives from the police department. Amara sat near the head of the long wooden table, her white coat absent, replaced by a simple blouse and blazer. Even without her usual uniform, her presence commanded attention. Chief Carter opened the meeting with a speech about accountability and the need for change. His tone was measured, but Amara could sense the tension in the room. Many of the community members were skeptical, their arms crossed and their gazes sharp. "This board represents a step forward," Carter said, his eyes scanning the room. "A chance to bridge the gap between the community and law enforcement. But it will only work if we're honest about our failures, our fears, and our hopes." When he finished, the room was silent. All eyes turned to Amara as the de facto symbol of the board's mission. She straightened in her chair, feeling the weight of their expectations. "I'm not here to make anyone comfortable," she began, her voice calm but firm. "Comfort doesn't save lives. Accountability does. If we're serious about change, we need more than words. We need transparency, we need action, and we need consequences." Her words hung in the air, resonating like a challenge. Some nodded in agreement, while others shifted uneasily in their seats. Voices of the community. The meeting continued with testimonies from community members who shared their experiences with law enforcement. A middle-aged man recounted how his teenage son had been stopped and frisked on his way home from school. A young woman described the fear she felt every time she drove through certain neighborhoods. Each story painted a damning picture of a system that had failed the people it was meant to protect. Amara listened intently, her hands clasped in front of her. She could see the pain in their eyes, the anger in their voices. It was a reminder of why she had agreed to be here. When it was her turn to speak again, she addressed the room with a sense of urgency. "What happened to me on that highway wasn't an isolated incident. It's part of a larger pattern, one that won't change unless we confront it head-on. And that starts with acknowledging the truth. Bias isn't just a problem for individuals. It's built into the system." Her words struck a chord, igniting a heated discussion about police training, accountability, and the role of community oversight. Chief Carter occasionally interjected, but for the most part, he let the conversation unfold. Amara appreciated his restraint. It showed that he was willing to listen, even when the criticism was aimed squarely at him. Behind closed doors. After the meeting, Carter approached Amara as she was gathering her notes. "You were incredible in there," he said, his tone genuine. Amara gave him a small, weary smile. "It's not about being incredible. It's about being honest." He nodded, his expression serious. "I meant what I said about making changes, but it's not easy. There's resistance within the department, within the city council. Not everyone wants to see the system change. Then they're part of the problem," Amara said bluntly. "And problems need solutions." Carter sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "I know, but change takes time." "Time is a luxury some people don't have," she replied, thinking of Elliot and the countless others who had been let down by the system. "We don't have the option to wait." Carter didn't argue. He simply nodded, his face etched with determination. A new challenge. As the advisory board gained traction, so did the backlash. Conservative media outlets accused Amara of being anti-police, a narrative she found both infuriating and absurd. Online, trolls flooded her social media accounts with hateful comments, calling her a troublemaker and worse. Even within the hospital, some colleagues treated her differently, either avoiding her altogether or making veiled comments about her newfound activism. One afternoon, as she reviewed a patient's chart, Naomi approached her with a look of concern. "You okay?" "Define okay," Amara said without looking up. Naomi placed a hand on her shoulder. "You've been under a lot of pressure lately. You don't have to carry all of this alone." Amara finally looked at her friend, her expression softening. "I know, but this isn't just about me. It's about something bigger. If I don't speak up, who will?" Naomi nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "Just don't forget to take care of yourself, too. You can't pour from an empty cup." Building bridges. Despite the challenges, Amara remained committed to the board's mission. She worked tirelessly, juggling her responsibilities as a surgeon with her new role as an advocate. Her days were long, and her nights were often sleepless, but she refused to let the weight of it all break her. One of the most significant breakthroughs came during a meeting with the officers who had stopped her on the highway. At Carter's insistence, they had been required to attend a session with the advisory board to discuss their actions and their biases. The tension in the room was palpable as Amara faced them. The younger officer avoided her gaze, while the older one sat with his arms crossed, his expression defensive. "Do you understand the consequences of your actions that night?" Amara asked, her tone measured but firm. "Do you realize how close you came to costing a young boy his life?" The older officer scoffed. "We were doing our job." "No," Amara said, her voice rising slightly. "Your job is to protect and serve. That night, you did neither." For a moment, the room was silent. Then, to everyone's surprise, the younger officer spoke up. I didn't know. I didn't understand what was at stake. But now I do. And I'm sorry." His words were a small step, but they were a step nonetheless. Amara nodded, her expression softening slightly. Understanding is the first step. But it's not enough. What matters is what you do next. A glimmer of hope. As the months went on, the advisory board began to see tangible results. New policies were implemented, including stricter accountability measures and improved bias training. Community outreach programs were launched, and while resistance remained, there was also a growing sense of hope. For Amara, the work was far from over. But for the first time, she felt like progress was possible. She had found her voice, not just as a doctor, but as an advocate for justice. And she wasn't going to stop until the system that had failed so many was rebuilt into something better. Late one night, as she looked out over the city from her apartment window, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. It had been painful, exhausting, and at times terrifying. But it had also been necessary. Change wasn't easy, but it was worth it. And Amara was ready to see it through. The cost of change. Months into her dual role as a trauma surgeon and an advocate for systemic reform, Dr. Amara Ellis was no stranger to the price of change. The advisory board had made significant strides, but with every small victory came resistance, both subtle and overt. Amara had learned to brace herself for the battles, yet the toll they took was undeniable. Her days at the hospital remained as demanding as ever. Surgeries blurred into one another. Each life she saved a reminder of why she couldn't afford to falter. But when the scrubs came off, the fight continued. Whether it was speaking at community forums, attending board meetings, or addressing the media, her time was no longer her own, a target on her back. The opposition to the advisory board was growing louder. Local law enforcement unions accused her of vilifying the police. Anonymous emails flooded her inbox, some questioning her motives, others outright threatening her safety. Online, trolls churned out vitriol with startling creativity, crafting narratives that painted her as a divisive force and a danger to public safety. It was during one particularly grueling week that the harassment escalated. Amara was walking to her car after a late-night shift when she noticed a note tucked under her windshield wiper. The words were scrawled in bold, angry handwriting. "You think you can fix everything. Watch your back." Amara's chest tightened as she scanned the dimly lit parking lot. Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay composed. She slipped the note into her pocket and climbed into her car, locking the doors immediately. As she drove home, her thoughts churned. The threats were becoming harder to ignore. She hadn't told Naomi or Chief Carter about them, not wanting to seem weak or deterred. But as the shadows of the city streets loomed around her, she began to question how much more she could endure. A fractured system. The next morning, Amara was back at the hospital, exhausted but determined. She had a full schedule of surgeries, including a high-risk case that required every ounce of her focus. Yet even as she prepped for the operating room, her mind drifted to the advisory board. She thought about the countless stories she'd heard, stories of lives lost or forever changed because of a system that refused to adapt. There was the young man who was paralyzed after being mistaken for a suspect, the single mother whose son was wrongfully arrested and missed his scholarship interview. Each story felt like a weight on her shoulders, a reminder of why she couldn't stop. But the resistance wasn't just external. Within the board, tension simmered. Some members wanted to push for sweeping reforms, while others advocated for incremental changes, fearing backlash. Amara found herself caught in the middle, trying to balance urgency with pragmatism. During a heated meeting, one of the board members, a retired judge named Helen Moreno, voiced her frustrations. "We can't fix everything overnight," she said, her tone sharp. "We have to be strategic." "Strategic doesn't save lives," Amara countered, her voice unwavering. "Every delay, every compromise, costs someone their future. I won't accept that." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Chief Carter, seated at the head of the table, finally spoke. "Dr. Ellis is right. We can't afford to let fear dictate our actions. Change is hard, but it's necessary." Amara met his gaze and gave a small nod of appreciation. For all their differences, she respected his willingness to stand by her. The breaking point. One evening, after a particularly draining surgery, Amara returned home to find her apartment vandalized. The front door had been spray-painted with the words, "Stay out of it." Her windows were smashed, shards of glass littering the floor. She stood frozen in the doorway, a mixture of fear and anger coursing through her. Naomi arrived within minutes after receiving a frantic call from Amara. "This is getting out of hand," she said, her voice trembling as she surveyed the damage. "You need to report this." Amara shook her head, her hands clenched into fists. "And what happens after I report it? They dismiss it as a random act. Blame me for being outspoken. I've seen this play out before, Naomi. It doesn't end with justice. But you can't keep carrying this alone." Naomi insisted. "You need protection, Amara. This isn't just about you. It's about everything you're fighting for." Amara stared at her friend, her resolve wavering. She knew Naomi was right, but admitting vulnerability felt like a concession, a crack in her armor. A community united. Word of the vandalism spread quickly. Within days, the community rallied around Amara, organizing a vigil outside her apartment. Hundreds of people showed up, holding candles and signs that read, "Justice for all," and "We stand with Dr. Ellis." Amara stepped onto the small makeshift stage, her heart heavy but full. As she looked out at the crowd, she saw faces of every age and background. They weren't just there for her. They were there for the cause she had come to represent. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "This isn't about me. It's about all of us. About creating a world where no one has to fight for their humanity. Where justice isn't a privilege but a right." The crowd erupted into applause, their voices rising in a chorus of support. For the first time in weeks, Amara felt a spark of hope. Confronting the system, The advisory board's next meeting was unlike any before it. Chief Carter had arranged for city officials to attend, including the mayor and the police commissioner. It was a chance to present their findings and demand action. Amara stood at the front of the room, a slideshow of data and testimonies projected behind her. She spoke with the precision of a surgeon and the passion of an advocate, laying bare the systemic failures that had plagued their community. "We cannot ignore the truth any longer," she said, her voice echoing through the chamber. "Every delay, every excuse, costs lives. Change isn't optional. It's a moral imperative." When she finished, the room erupted into debate. Some officials nodded in agreement, while others pushed back, citing budget constraints and political risks. But Amara didn't waver. She met every objection with facts, every hesitation with conviction. By the end of the meeting, the mayor announced a commitment to increased funding for community programs and the establishment of an independent oversight committee. It wasn't everything Amara had hoped for, but it was a start. A hard-fought victory. That night, as Amara sat alone in her apartment, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. The fight was far from over, but progress had been made. The advisory board's efforts were bearing fruit, and the community was more united than ever. She thought about Elliot Carter, the boy whose life she had saved, and the countless others who deserved a future free from fear and prejudice. Their stories fueled her resolve, reminding her why she had chosen this path. As the city skyline glittered outside her window, Amara made a promise to herself. She would keep fighting, no matter the cost. Because some battles weren't just worth winning, they were worth everything. The light at the end. The cold air of early winter nipped at Dr. Amara Ellis as she stepped out of the municipal building. The advisory board had just concluded its final meeting of the year, and while the progress they had made was tangible, it came with a bittersweet sense of how far they still had to go. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and made her way toward her car, the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text from Chief Carter. "Thank you for everything this year. You've made a bigger impact than you know. Let's talk soon." Amara stared at the message for a moment, her breath visible in the crisp night air. The man who had once symbolized everything she distrusted about the system had become a tentative ally, someone who now shared her vision for a better future. It was a transformation she hadn't expected, but one she had come to appreciate. A glimmer of hope. The changes implemented by the advisory board were beginning to take root. The independent oversight committee had been established and was already reviewing cases that had long been ignored. Officers were undergoing mandatory bias training, and while some resisted, others openly embraced the opportunity to grow. One of the most surprising developments was the relationship Amara had begun to forge with Officer Jacob Burns, the younger of the two men who had stopped her on the highway. After their tense initial meeting, he had reached out, asking for a chance to speak privately. "I want to understand," he had said during their first conversation. "I didn't realize how much harm I was causing until you made me see it." Over the weeks, their conversations deepened. Burns began attending community forums and volunteering for outreach programs. He wasn't perfect, far from it, but his willingness to learn gave Amara a sense of cautious optimism. If he could change, perhaps others could too. Elliot's recovery. A few days before the holidays, Amara received an invitation to visit the Carter family. Chief Carter's son, Elliot, had been discharged from the hospital weeks ago, but she hadn't seen him since the surgery. She hesitated at first, unsure of how she felt about entering the home of a man whose officers had nearly cost his son his life. But eventually, she accepted. This was about more than her. It was about healing and moving forward. When she arrived, the house was warm and inviting, filled with the smell of baked goods and the sound of laughter. Elliot greeted her at the door, his face lighting up when he saw her. "Dr. Ellis," he exclaimed, his voice full of energy. "I can't thank you enough for what you did. My dad says I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you." Amara smiled, touched by his enthusiasm. "You're a fighter, Elliot. I just gave you the tools. You did the rest. As the evening went on, Amara found herself relaxing in the company of the Carter family. Chief Carter was more subdued than usual, his gaze thoughtful as he watched his son interact with their guests. At one point, he pulled Amara aside. "I owe you more than I can ever repay," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "Not just for saving Elliot, but for pushing me to see the truth about the system I've spent my life defending." Amara met his eyes, her own expression softening. "The truth isn't easy to face, but it's the only way we grow. And you've taken the first step. That matters." The weight of the fight. As the year drew to a close, Amara found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. The vandalism, the threats, and the relentless opposition had tested her in ways she never imagined. But through it all, she had discovered a resilience she hadn't known she possessed. Her role on the advisory board had forced her to confront parts of herself she had long buried: her anger, her fear, her hope. It had also shown her the power of community, the strength that came from people coming together to demand change. One evening, as she prepared for bed, she received a call from Naomi. "You've been quiet lately," her friend said, concern evident in her voice. "I'm just thinking," Amara admitted, "about everything we've been through this year, about what's next." "And what is next?" Naomi asked. Amara paused, her thoughts swirling. "I don't know yet, but whatever it is, I know I'm not done. There's too much at stake to stop now." The turning point. The new year brought with it renewed challenges and opportunities. Amara continued her work at the hospital, her surgical skills saving lives every day. But she also remained deeply involved with the advisory board, pushing for deeper reforms and holding the system accountable. One of the most significant moments came during a public town hall, where Amara was asked to share her story. Standing before a packed auditorium, she spoke of the night that changed her life, the call that had brought her to Elliot Carter, the officers who had stopped her, and the fight that had followed. "This isn't just my story," she said, her voice echoing through the room. "It's the story of countless others who've been silenced, dismissed, or ignored. But we're not staying silent anymore. Change is coming, and we're not backing down." The audience erupted into applause, their cheers a testament to the impact she had made. For the first time in months, Amara felt a sense of fulfillment that went beyond her work in the operating room. She was no longer just a healer, she was a catalyst for change. The road ahead. As Amara drove home that night, she thought about how far she had come. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but she wasn't afraid. She had faced prejudice, fear, and doubt, and she had emerged stronger for it. Her phone buzzed with a message from Chief Carter. "I just left the town hall. Your speech was incredible. Thank you for giving us hope." Amara smiled, her resolve solidifying. The fight for justice was far from over, but she was ready for whatever came next. She had found her voice, her purpose, and her strength. And she wasn't going to stop until the system she once distrusted was transformed into something better. As the city lights blurred past her, she whispered to herself, "This is only the beginning."